and Holy Spirit. Amen. Father, we come to you in thanks for the great things you are accomplishing. Praise for who you are, and with petitions for strength, wisdom, and clarity. You knit us together in the wombs of our mothers, and you desire for us to have life. Look in mercy and love upon all the precious lives of children yet unborn. Guard them and give them growth. For those who pray before abortion clinics, who march for life, who work for an end to the culture of death, for those who support the families you have designed, for all who teach the gospel of life and call others to repentance, that we all may be driven by love alone, that we model you and lead others to you. Please give each of us the grace to choose what is good and pleasing to you, especially in difficult situations when human life is threatened and the family you designed is under assault. Grant us the grace to repent of all sins against life, to renounce all shadows of the culture of death, and to rejoice in the gospel of life which you have given to us. Remind us that we're not defined by our abilities, our age, or condition of dependency, and may we treat each person as the marvelous creation that he or she is. For all parents facing an unexpected or difficult pregnancy, may they receive the necessary love and support needed from family, friends, community, and your church in order to open their minds to choose life for the child. Visit with grace those who have been part of an elective abortion. Bring them to repentance, but do not let them sink into despair. Forgive and heal their souls, and teach us to love them as you do, as you seek all souls to come to you. Give your wisdom to the leaders of this government and nations throughout the world, that they may seek to govern with justice and compassion, that they may seek to do what is right in your eyes, and not lean on their own understanding. May the right to religious liberty be honored and upheld, so that all may be able to worship and follow you freely. We also pray for those who wrongfully believe that they hold the power of life and death, and the ability to redefine your word to fit their purposes, and who trust in the choices of a sinful heart over your promises. Please frustrate their efforts, and turn the hearts of all who will not know you. Father and Creator of all, please grant this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Now, if you would please join me also now in standing and facing the flag while singing our nation's pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I have a few announcements to make before we get to talk with our legislators. First, Senator Liz Brown, whom you'll see as a panelist on the legislative panel here to my left, is one of the sponsors of the forum, as are Russ and Monica Yale. And as you know, Russ is also a city councilman here in Fort Wayne for the 2nd District. Please, let's give a big thank you to them for their support. Now, if you'll please, let's go over the folder that you picked up when you walked in. And if you have the folder, if you don't, there's one outside and one of the staffers is helping you. But inside, you'll find a directory of your elected officials, a sheet of legislative updates, which will be helpful as we guide our conversation here today about what's been happening in the session this year, and an upcoming events flyer showing some exciting things that are happening soon with Rights Life in Northeast Indiana. You'll also see some pens and radio guides from our great friends at Bot Radio, who are longtime supporters, and you can see in the back as well, right? Longtime supporters and sponsors of our events. You'll also find a card to write down any questions that you may have for our panelists. And so we would ask, if you do this, please make sure that you know that there's a cutoff time about 10:40. So you will see around you other staff members with badges like this. Please make sure that they get your card and they'll get them to us. We will do our best to be able to go through those. We may not be able to get all of them in. And some of your questions may actually already have been addressed in the other questions. But we will try to get to them as many as possible. And also, please note on the card if there's someone in particular that you want to end up directing your question to. You'll also find a folder in the donation envelope to help us defray these operation costs. And your donations, however big or small, enable us to carry on our mission of keeping human life sacred from the moment of conception to the moment of natural death. And that is, all innocent human life is sacred. If you would fill out your envelope and then place it in the bucket at the registration table when you leave, that would be greatly appreciated. And if you need more time, please take the envelope with you for your consideration. Please feel free to take all the contents of the packet with you, but if you don't need the folder, we'll reuse it and help defray some of our costs. But also, as I said, before we introduce our legislative panel, I would also like to recognize the other elected officials in attendance here today. On behalf of United States Senator Jim Banks, we have Mr. Darren Vogt. We have Allen County Councilman Josh Hale. He's also the New Haven Fire Chief. We also have Fort Wayne City Councilman Dr. Scott Myers, who will be arriving. And as I said, also, we have Fort Wayne City Councilman Russ Yale. These elected officials show their support for life with both their words and their actions, and they show up. And that's so important, and we are extremely grateful. Now, the legislators on our panel are no exception, as they are some pretty amazing advocates themselves. First, we have State Senator, and hopefully I have exactly the right titles, but Assistant Majority Leader, Floor Leader Liz Brown, representing District 15. We have, we have State Senator and Assistant Majority Caucus Chair, Dr. Tyler Johnson, who represents District 14. And then we also have State Representative and Majority Floor Leader Matt Lehman for District 79. And finally, we have our own CEO of Rights Life of Northeast Indiana and the Executive Vice President of Indiana Rights Life, Zachary Rodgers. Now, panelists, let's go down the line to have you further introduce yourselves and share what initially drew you to run for public office.
Again, Liz Brown. I live in Fort Wayne, and I represent Fort Wayne up to Huntertown, only in Allen County. And so, actually, I originally ran for school board, which most people don't realize, Fort Wayne Community School Board. And since you don't know, I lost the election, obviously. And so that sort of spurred me more than anything. I realized I wanted to get involved in the community. There were some issues particularly passionate to me, and then I ran for city council and eventually ended up here. But overriding any of the issues that I've ever been engaged in would be this issue. This is absolutely paramount to me, and if there's nothing else that I can ever say I'm proud of is our special session and that legislation and the legislation that preceded that, knowing that this is just, it's a long battle, and it's something that we're always going to have to be diligent about.
Yeah, so I got involved in politics probably about 10 years ago on the healthcare side of things. I'm an ER doc in my day job, and one of the things that really pushed us were a lot of the social issues in healthcare, as far as kind of the overbearingness of government and those discussions, abortion being one of them. Started my political career really getting involved with anti-abortion activities, kind of the legal side of medicine and abortion, trying to figure out some of those details. A very good friend of mine runs a national group of pro-life physicians, and so been working on the national stage for a little while. But family life and locally, we tried to kind of retreat from the world over the last decade. And so our goal was to get a family farm, get settled down, kind of get out of things. And mid-2021, kind of got slapped upside the head by God that I was hiding from the world and needed to do a little bit more. So made the jump and got involved and ran in a really tough primary. And God's really blessed us in every step of that way. And it's been amazing. And one of the things that as soon as I announced is everybody was like, well, yeah, we need a position in the Senate. And that's been very, very clear, and been nice to speak on a lot of the the medical issues. And only downside is I got here about a year or two late after special session, and so we've been working to get past a good piece of legislation, not perfect, but a good piece of legislation after fighting that out through special session. I got to be there for that, but it was interesting to step in and kind of see the aftermath of that.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. District 79, if you don't know, is Adams, Wells, and Jay County. I've been in legislature since 2008, and initially my district had the western side or eastern side of Allen County, and then the southern part of Allen County, and now no part of Allen County. But I still have such great ties to Allen County, which is why I was doing this. Got involved, I would say, number one is I wanted to have a job where I could wear a suit and tie every day, which is false. I was giving Adam a hard time. But I got involved in county government. I've always had, my parents were very influential in my life, and they were both very good servants. My dad in the church, my mom in activities. And so I really felt like I wanted to serve. And so I found that government was something that appealed to me. The first person I could vote for was Ronald Reagan. I remember in the government class, we had to pick as a senior, you had to pick someone you're going to vote for, and two-thirds of the class was Carter, and I'm like, well, I kind of like that Reagan guy, and so started learning more and really got myself deeper and deeper into the conservative politics. So that kind of drove me. Served in county council down in Adams County for a number of years before I ran for the state house. But really, I would say the issues that have driven me was abortion was one. My mom was very active in the pro-life movement, did the walks, did the protests, did those things. Unfortunately, she passed away the year before we passed the ban. So I remember when I voted for that, my first thought was I'm voting for my mom. That meant a lot to me, really did. So I think that's what drove, I think all of us would say that's what drove us into politics, was not to be a politician, but to be a servant. What drives us every day is making sure that we're doing that and keeping that faith that we are serving the public.
I am not the elected official, but good morning. Up until last Saturday, I was the Wells County Republican Party chairman, and thankfully gave that up after 8 years. But I have done everything except for the elected official role, I think, in politics, and there's no way I'm jumping into that one. Especially when we've got such amazing panelists up here that are doing all the good work that I would want to do. I started getting involved in politics in 2004 and have been engaged in that ever since then, and really fell in love with the pro-life movement. Had always been pro-life, especially growing up in the church and trying to be more like Jesus every day. And so I fell in love with the pro-life movement later on in that process, and my predecessor, who is the only other executive director in Right to Life of Northeast Indiana's history, asked me to come on board, and then eventually about 6 months later I accepted the position to run the organization. And ever since then have felt almost a daily confirmation that I'm exactly where God wants me to be, which is a pretty cool feeling, especially in ministry. Not everybody gets to have that experience, and so I'm thankful to be one of these things is not like the other on the panel person. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you all. Now, the next portion of our panel is in our forum here is the panel discussion, and I'll address each of you with some questions, but the other panelists, feel free to chime in as appropriate. So the first one is for Senator Liz Brown. In the 2022 special session, where the state legislators passed SEA 2 in addition to the Life Bill SEA 1. SEA 2 significantly increased funding for pregnancy resource centers. Can you talk about some of the positive effects that you see coming from that bill in regards to women and families?
Excuse me. And so actually, let me just go back a little bit. That was actually really strategic too, right? Because it was such a heated, difficult time. And convincing some of our pro-life colleagues who all of a sudden were getting a little bit of cold feet about that whole issue is what's the fundamental reason we're doing this? And it's for moms and babies, right? And good outcomes. And so that was actually an opportunity to start funding programs and institutions that take care of moms and babies, whether it's pregnancy resource centers or nurse family partnerships, which we hadn't done in the past. You know, they were just another budget item that would be considered sort of thing. So actually, you know, we doubled down, those of us who voted for Senate Bill 1, that special session, we doubled down and said, not only is it important to us that these women get the information that they need so that they understand that that life is going to be supported after the baby's born, not just through their 9 months, but that was an opportunity for us, and as a state, to prove that. We're not just virtue signaling by saying we support this, we're actually going to put our money behind it too. And so I think we will continue to see that grow, and the benefit is to the entire state, right? We're gonna have healthy outcomes, we're supportive, so we're gonna grow our family support, and that's just better for society. So I have seen that, for example, the pregnancy resource centers continue to grow and provide support. And what I have to emphasize always is, we're not the sole funder, right? We need to be a partner with them, but as I look at two of the colleagues I know and friends who've done this forever, they do a lot of funding and outreach in their own communities, and that's important because you want your communities to have a stake in that and to understand that issue and to also surround those women and the fathers of those babies with support. And so we're going to continue that. Nurse family partnerships are now, I think, in every county, which wasn't the case before. And all these organizations are sending a message that the state of Indiana is supportive from conception on, and we're going to follow those babies, which we've been accused of not doing in the past. So that is really a significant thing.
The next question is for Senator Johnson. Before the life bill came from the special session was implemented, abortion pills accounted for over 50% of the abortions in Indiana. Now we're dealing with some would say an epidemic, some would say a tidal wave of abortion pill usage, which is legal in some other states, but illegal in Indiana. How do we prevent abortion pills from being mailed and used in the state of Indiana under our law?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's been one of the things that before I was a legislator, we've been trying to tackle for some time. It sounds great to make abortion pills illegal, to shut down clinics. A lot of what the special session did push a lot of the abortions into hospitals, and you can't really get it outside of that. Well, that's nice to say, but what's really happening is abortion pills are being shipped across Indiana today. There's a few friends of mine who follow data from website traffic, even some insurance claims, complications for abortion pills, and have estimates that we probably have thousands of abortions that still occur in Indiana from the abortion pill. We do. It's just a matter of knowing the exact number. And so that's been a difficult thing. So even as special session was happening, a group of friends and I drafted a lawsuit against the Biden administration. We filed it in Texas. There's some reasons for that, but one of my colleagues was in Texas, so the 4 physicians that filed that got together and said, hey, how do we stop this? And one of the big things is bad federal policy that the Biden administration, the Obama administration did was said, hey, the abortion pill is completely safe. You need no FDA safeguards around it. So you can just mail it. A physician doesn't even need to prescribe it really in that scenario. There doesn't need to be a visit. We don't treat any other medication, abortion or not, that way. And so they gave mifepristone and the abortion pill a special status in that. And so what we said is, as physicians, is that it was harming our patients, which it was. It was killing some of our patients, which it was. And it was creating really bad outcomes. And so we sued the federal government. It takes about a year to go through that process, and we eventually got to the Supreme Court, and they heard our case at the Supreme Court. So that was an interesting experience for me personally to sit in front of the justices, have them talk about the case. And essentially what happened was they punted because the election was coming up and they didn't want to weigh in. That's, if you ask my opinion, that's what happened. They didn't rule on standing, which kind of a scapegoat in the process. So I wish they would have. They even admitted that the case was strong, and now the states, depending on what the Trump administration does, which I've been privy to some of those conversations already, and if you watched any of the confirmation hearings for Dr. Bakari or Dr. Bhattacharya at the NIH and FDA, a bunch of the questions have been around the abortion bill, and that's the reason why. I'm pretty sure they'll do the right thing and move it back, and we probably need federal legislation to do as much too. There are some things we can do as a state, but they're limited because it goes across state lines. And so I actually have legislation to try to give the AG some power to, if you think of RICO and tax statutes and things like that, give them some power to actually go after some of these bad actors and make it criminal to move the abortion bill the way it is now. And we've not got any traction on that bill yet, but that's kind of the purpose of where we're going.
Doctor, just as a quick follow-up, for the layperson, what is the policy reason, or what would be the medical reason for being concerned about medication being mailed into a patient and then treating themselves with that pill?
Yeah, I mean, setting abortion aside, as far as, abortion's bad and every abortion's a tragedy, the abortion pill itself has some very unique challenges when you administer it. When a woman takes it and she has late-term pregnancy, it can cause some real issues. That was one of the cases I presented, was a young lady who had taken the abortion pill in Chicago and drove back home and actually bled to death. In that process, we had to revive her and give her blood, and actually ended up in our hospital. And so that was one of the cases that we used in our case. And so it's not as safe as Tylenol as some people would. It's actually a very dangerous drug. And so not only does it kill babies, but it kills the mom along with it. And so it's one of those things that you have to kind of make a twisted argument in your mind, because you're saying, hey, the abortion pill, we're not really saying it's okay, but when you give it, it's still not okay. Here's why. So it's one of those areas where you kind of have to fight the fight and play the game a little bit to get the ball moving in our direction.
Thank you. Next, we'll go
I'm gonna jump in on that one,
yeah,
though.
yes.
Some of the states, and you'll see this if you're following a lot of the life-related issues, a lot of these very, very liberal pro-abortion states are passing shield laws, which essentially is allowing abortionists to mail these pills to pro-life states, and when the pro-life states are trying to push back, the pro-abortion states are basically saying, no, we've got a statute, we've got a law that protects our folks. And if you really want to see some awful, disgusting behavior, you can look at New York's Governor Hochul, and her response protecting some of the most heinous pro-abortion pill providers, sending them to Indiana, sending them to Texas. I mean, this abortionist is killing thousands and thousands of babies and women all across the United States. And until the Supreme Court essentially takes this up, we got to continue to find unique ways to fight back.
Anyone else? All right. We'll go to Representative Lehman now. There was an adoption of a funding bill during there was an adoption funding bill during this session, that is House Bill 1503, that was passed in the Committee on Family, Children, and Human Affairs, but then was recommitted to the Ways and Means Committee in February. What sort of impact on families and foster care could a program like this could have implemented? And if you could also explain just a little bit procedurally how that recommitted to the Ways and Means, what that means for us as lay people, please.
Yeah, so thank you. 1503 had two parts to it, and it had to do with zero cost adoptions. And if you remember, when Eric Dogan became the first one to kind of promote that philosophy, and I think it goes to what I think Liz said earlier on. The criticism against us has always been all you care about is abortion, and that's not true. What we care about is babies. And so that's from conception till the time when they are not wanted as babies, then we got to find a place to put them. Right now, a lot of those end up in foster care. There's some problems in our foster care. So this bill kind of addressed, if you want to pull that child out or prevent them from going into foster care through adoption, that we're going to have the resources through kind of a non-governmental establishment of a group, and then also not just for the adoption cost itself, but also possibly some additional funds for a child that needs to have therapy. Maybe you adopt someone with some health issues, helping you with some of those costs. And it was a little bit of state money and a lot more public money or private money. And then the second part of the bill was, so the private money was a tax credit, allowing you to take a 50% of your donation in a tax deduction or tax credit. The process of that is what took it to Ways and Means. Instead of kind of take a step back, bills that deal with a particular issue get assigned to the committee of that issue. So this went through Family, Child Services, things like that committee. They debate the structure of the bill. Is this a good public policy or not a good public policy? Came out of the committee actually 10-0, so it was supported, bipartisan support. But because of that fiscal piece, because of that tax credit, it has to go through Ways and Means. So any bill that has any spending, any sort of tax credits has to go through the Ways and Means Committee. So it got recommitted there. If you kind of take a step back and say, okay, where's Indiana at financially? We have done very well. We're very structured. We've balanced budget. We have to have a balanced budget. We're going into a fiscal year budget time right now that's going to be very, very tight. We're hearing maybe 3% growth the first year, flat the second year. So anything that's going to give a tax credit, a reduction of those things, that creates anything to do with funding, is going to be with some scrutiny. There used to be a time when you would have a list in Ways and Means of, okay, these are some projects we'd like to see take fruition, and you would put 10, 15, 20 of those things into the budget because you had the funds to do that. Now what we're doing is we're taking those and putting them on a list of first in. Okay, so these are all out. What's going to be one of the first in? If we get a better forecast in April, which we get a final forecast in the month of April, what our budget's going to look like, if the revenue's there, if the funds are available, this is at somewhat at the top of that list. It's towards that, hey, if we can, we're going to put this back into the budget. So I always tell people where we're at right now in the process is that there's one thing you need to keep in mind, and that is April the 29th. Now, hopefully we can end a little bit earlier than that, but that's the last day. And the last 2 weeks of session are when things finally begin to take shape. You're seeing a lot of things right now that are approached with an axe, and then you get down to, as Dr. Johnson would appreciate, the scalpel. You get down to the now we got to make sure we hone this thing to where we balance our budget, we do what we're constitutionally required to do. At the same time, maybe some of these other programs can find their way back in. In talking with Chairman Thompson, who is a very strong pro-life chairman of that committee, admits that it's probably a good program. I think there's some merit to it. I wouldn't be surprised if you see some pieces of that show up somewhere else in the process as we get towards the end. But I think as a whole, the way the bill is now, it's fiscally, it's just not in the budget, and it's not going to probably make it in the budget as it sits now. There's going to be some changes, or we'll see what our forecast is in April. But it has a lot of support because, again, especially the kids in foster care, if you have someone who's saying, I'm going to adopt a child out of foster care, we need more and more people like that. I come from a family of, my wife and I have 3 daughters, and everybody else in my family, my siblings, have adopted. My brother has his own, but my sisters and 2 sisters alone have 14 kids they've adopted, all across the world, basically. I said when we get together, it's like the UN conference, but so adoption is very near and dear to my heart. I know how it works, and I know the struggle that moms and dads go through who want to have kids and can't, in my sister's case. And so these types of situations are what they were primed for, is pulling these kids out of a horrible situation if we can do something as a state to make that more affordable, more attractive, and get these kids into those types of loving homes, then we're gonna try to get there.
Did you have a follow-up? This one is for Zach of Rights Life Northeast Indiana. Once again, the annual end-of-life options bill, that is House Bill 1011, was filed this session. Where does that bill stand, and what would be the implications if it were passed?
Yeah, thankfully, Representative Pierce doesn't get a hearing on that bill in the House. Every year, I like to update everybody at this forum on that bill because it shocks me that someone can continuously make an awful, horrific bill worse. But every year he jumps up and does it. So, you know, if you've come to these before, you've heard me speak a lot about the MAID program, the medical assistance in dying. I'm pretty passionate about being against programs like this. It is still the fastest growing way to die in the country of Canada. And I wrote a couple of things down from their program that I wanted to share. One of which is the law no longer requires a person's natural death to be reasonably foreseeable to access medical assistance in dying. In other words, it doesn't need to be terminal. It actually doesn't even need to be medical in the sense of like having a disease. It actually can be a mental health issue. Folks with dementia can apply and receive medical assistance in dying from the government to kill themselves. One of the phrases that they use is depriving someone of their legal and constitutional rights is a serious matter and should be done rarely and for as short of a period as possible. It's a fancy way of saying safe, legal, and rare. And I feel like I've heard that before. So this is something that needs to be on everybody's radar. In 2021 to 2022, there was a 26.5% increase in those that chose to die by the state government, and then another 16%. So since 2021, cumulatively, there's roughly 50% more people have chosen to die at the government's hands than before. Again, the fastest way to die in Canada is for the government to give you medicine to kill yourself. That should horrify everyone that our neighbors to the north are doing this pretty regularly. They wrote in a sunset clause a couple weeks ago to allow a few more years of the mental health, the dementia, and all of that to kick in. But this is something that is on our doorstep in a very real way. And there are some in the State House of Representatives that are supportive of this. Thankfully, again, not enough to get a hearing or really go into this, but it's something that you need to have knowledge of as a pro-life community, because it really is, it's a scary thing to think about that coming to America.
So last year, we carried a resolution condemning physician-assisted suicide, which was interesting to see some of my Democrat colleagues' reactions. You know, there's many in the House side that are even appalled by the bill itself, which is good. But you look at Canada to our north, last year was the 5th leading cause of death in Canada, right? So car accidents, heart disease, cancer, and then somebody else killing you because you asked them to, right? And that's really bizarre in our minds. And so when you get to the United States, there's a big movement push for this from the West Coast. And so we need to do really good not to open up the cracks in this at all. It's already illegal in Indiana, we'll keep it that way, but we need to keep pushing back and keep showing people how absurd it actually is.
And there is a huge movement of essentially my colleagues, that it's the Right to Life folks in Canada that are pushing back, and that's who really got the sunset pushed back. And so hopefully they can continue to work on that, but they're significantly more liberal in the Great North. So,
One thing to add, maybe just, because I did actually get some calls on this early because it was the very first bill filed. And so when you see the number 1011 the first 10 bills of every General Assembly session, the long session, are what we call our priority bills. Those are our bills that we're going to file. 10101 is always the budget. And then the rest fall into what we feel are priorities. So the first bill filed is always going to be 1011. And so that is always the first bill filed. Matt Pierce always files it. And interestingly enough, you're talking about the Democrats, is he has no co-authors. Normally, if there's something people coalesce around, you'll get 5, 6, you get a bunch of people want to be on that bill with you. He's never gotten a co-author. I think I think Matt honestly believes in this. I really think he does. But I also think it is something that he files to gin up the base, you might say. He's from Bloomington. And I think he just honestly believes this and believes that we need to, be discussing this. But it has, and I'm telling you this, it'll come back next year, and the year after, and the year after, and the year after. As long as Matt Pierce is there, we'll file this bill. And as long as we're there, it'll never get a hearing.
What I find interesting about this is, at the same time, sometimes the Democrats, but we've had discussions in both chambers about how we need to do more for those who have mental health issues, and it's become an increasing issue and a problem, and in terms of how to fund that and how to provide services. So it is ironic that some of the same politicians who advocate for that will then literally flip and say, but they should have a right to kill themselves. Of course, they don't say that, right? But if you say you just want them to be able to kill themselves, well, that's not what I mean. And then the other piece that I always find disturbing, which really brings us back to this, we start this whole movement, if you will, with pro-life with babies in the womb, but it's all about the dignity of life, right? It's all about where we are and whether we're normal or physically able and everything, and how your life has value. And that's what I always find interesting. When they push this, they always look at someone who's terminally ill. They're suffering and they're in pain, and how can you make them go through this? You're awful. And I just think, well, then isn't that on us, that the health community, and us to make sure that we rally around them, give them the support they need as much as we can, make sure they're pain-free, knowing that there's dignity in suffering as well. I mean, we're in Lent, right? That's Christ's suffering. That's what we're supposed to also contemplate. But at the same time, they're just so willing to say, that's not worthy. So they should have the right to kill themselves, because it's never going to be someone healthy, able, I have a great life, I'm doing well, I'm physically fit. No, they're a little bit less, something's not going 100% for them, so they should be able to kill themselves. No, we all have a right to live, and we should all try to support that. And that is what is so disturbing to me. Just like the baby in the womb, who a mom and dad might get a diagnosis that there's going to be something a little bit special about that baby, right? And we should embrace that and celebrate that instead of saying, oh, that's too bad. And that's what's disturbing about this issue. And I'll just leave it with, the first year I was a legislator, they had these national conferences. It's the last time I went to this one. And it was up in Chicago, and I go into this event, I didn't really understand it. It said death with dignity. And I thought, oh, this is about hospice care and things like that. And I quickly realized it's a very deceiving name. It's this physician-assisted suicide. And I just sort of sat in the back of the room and looked at all these wackadoodles talking about how great this is. And I just thought, what have I gotten myself into? But I definitely didn't go back to that.
I think the other thing too is, you take that also a step further. We've warned in situations like this that it's a slippery slope, and we always get blasted for saying stuff like that. But the MAID program in Canada started with terminally ill and has to be about ready to die in the next, I forget if it's 6 months or 3 months or something like that. Then it became just a terminal illness diagnosis. Could be 5 years, could be 10 years, but just a terminal illness diagnosis. Then it became a severe health instance. So you could have something that's debilitating, so they keep pushing that further and further, If you don't think they want that to be where then they get to decide who lives and dies, I mean, I've got a bridge to sell you, because that's what they want. That is the point of keep pulling that back to allow additional people to be included in how they choose you to die.
Senator Brown, termination of pregnancy reports, otherwise known as TPRs, have long been available for public access, which allows for oversight of the abortion law. The governor's executive order to make these reports public again after being considered previously as private medical records and made confidential in 2024 was signed last month, but now has been challenged in court and is stalled. So what is the importance of making TPRs visible to the public, and where does this issue currently stand?
I'm going to have to pour my colleague here, because I'd have to say this was probably one of the most disappointing things legislatively last year. And Senator Johnson, I'm sure will chime in. He worked so hard on us trying to codify that, because the previous administration allowed their Department of Health to say that that was a medical record and therefore protected by HIPAA, et cetera, et cetera. And their absolutely ridiculous argument was that since we have reduced the number of abortions in Indiana, now they're discoverable and the patient's identity may be revealed. I mean, think about how ridiculous that is. So even though, obviously, when we had the abortion clinic here, and many of you were probably praying across the street and watching women go in and have the abortion or not, we were collecting those termination of pregnancy reports, and that's how we found out about them doing abortions on 13-year-olds and the consequences of women dying or having serious physical medical issues after that. And so that was probably one of the most disappointing things of the last administration, that basically on the way out of the door after 8 years, they decided we're going to protect these. And I'd have to say, and Dr. Johnson can talk about the details, I'm a little still concerned that it's only an executive order, because that can change with every administration. And so we do need to codify that. And of course, who is the voice, the spokesperson for the lawsuit? Dr. Caitlin Bernard, the woman who did the abortion, the physician who did the abortion out in India on the 10-year-old, who calls all of us like we're the worst people in the world because, we don't care what happens to children when they're victims of sexual assault. And she's going to continue that. She's going to continue that, and until we put that into law and make sure, hopefully someday she'll just move to a different state. But that just shows you she's never going to give up, even after we pass that law, until we can never go.
Yeah, Senator Brown worked on this with me last year quite a bit, and being a second-year legislator trying to navigate through that was interesting. I know the Department of Health Commissioner very well, and it became an interesting fight because they did a good job of making the issue very muddy and confusing when it really wasn't. We know what a medical record is. It's very well defined in healthcare, so we don't have to go and try to figure this out 15 different ways. So I was able to put some language together last year. The legislative process can be very frustrating, as my colleagues up here will let you know, when you think you have a simple way to fix a difficult issue. And so as the governor was running for office, I was able to get his ear this summer and talk about the issue. So when he got into office, I made him aware of those discussions and where it needed to be fixed, because it was created a problem by our previous governor, so the current governor could fix it. Well, we still filed Senate Bill 240, which has TPR fixed in it, and we didn't move it because of the executive order. That was a mistake. We're trying to fix that mistake right now, because anytime you can legislate something rather than have an executive order, it's much better. They also settled a lawsuit with Voices for Life, which has some language in it which should firm up the current lawsuit that's going to be filed. There's not an injunction necessarily, so if you ask for a FOIA request of TPRs today, which I did just a few days ago, you should still get them. So we're not hiding them anymore. And then I met with the Department of Health Commissioner last Tuesday, and we we should have a good outcome even if they keep suing us because of where we stand. But it'd be nice to put it into code, and then it makes it much more difficult for them to have any good outcome on their side. These are important. Kathy Humbarger spent a number of years fighting this, and I hear from her regularly about fixing it because it really needs to be, and it's something that's not unique to Indiana. It's pretty well established, so you could get the Department of Health says it's difficult to release these because there's so few now, which is a good thing, but they don't have any qualms about measles cases in Northwest Indiana and going on the news and talking about it when it's one case. So they don't really have any ground to stand on in those discussions. So we'll keep fighting. It's one of those things where it gets very frustrating in the legislative process. As these folks know, there's a lot of voices and a lot of different opinions on these things, and so it's our job to influence our colleagues as much as possible and make them feel comfortable moving something like this. Language is always alive until session's over, even though we didn't move it out of the first half, and so we'll try to find a home for that as we start meeting again for the second half.
A small follow-up, and maybe Zach, you can answer this. If we're talking to our neighbors, our friends, our family about this concept, what is the real value of the TPR? How does that help us in assessing public health issues?
I can take this because really we've allowed abortion to be legal in Indiana, right? We have certain cases that you can do an abortion for. Now, we're trying to define where that line in medicine between what is an abortion and what is taking care of a fetal demise or fatal fetal anomaly. We don't have any of that defined. And so that's our fault in medicine as pro-life doctors, is not drawing that line where that is. We're still having debates on what brain death is. And so some of those are very difficult answers medically and scientifically to answer. And so that creates a little bit of a gray area. I don't think it's much of a gray area personally, but when you look at the medical debates back and forth, that is where some of the gray areas apply. So when you look at most of the abortions that occur in Indiana, they all occur in a hospital, all the ones that are reported. Well, we talked about the abortion pills earlier, but we're talking about abortion pills and surgical abortions that occur in a hospital right now. The abortionist has to fill out paperwork defining why and how they perform the abortion. And so that does help us find bad actors in the current law and make sure, even in some current examples, they're trying to hide the exact procedure they're doing, so that we know that women are treated humanely in this process, even though babies are being killed in that process many of the time. So it does help us track when and where. If you really look at the TPRs we have now in the last year, most of the abortions occur at one location or two locations in Indianapolis. So it makes it easier to figure out or follow that they are following the law.
Zach, do you have something else?
Yeah, one thing to be aware of for those of you that are believers, like my understanding is the hearing for that is on Wednesday, and it's either at 9 or 9:30 for the temporary restraining order on the executive order, which I'm not a legal scholar, so I find new things out all the time. I didn't know you could do a temporary restraining order on a piece of paper, but they did, and so that it was pushed back until Wednesday, assuming that it still goes on in Wednesday. I'm a big believer that prayer is incredibly powerful, so if you could say a prayer for that Wednesday. Trying not to be overly pessimistic, but I will be surprised if we come out victorious on that on Wednesday morning. But then we will immediately have that challenged and get it up to the state Supreme Court. So hopefully we can move quickly on that, but wanted to make sure people knew that was happening.
All right, Senator Johnson, there were a couple of bills proposed in this session that were targeted to educate different constituents. Two that I'm going to talk about, even though they're House bills and I know you're in the Senate, but House Bill 1508 and 1325. 1508 would have required schools to give instruction on fetal development in grades 6 through 8, and then 1325 would have required the Indiana Department of Health to create a video for practitioners concerning the state's abortion laws and the standard of care for treating pregnant women with life-threatening conditions. What impact would those two bills have had in moving the culture of life forward?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's really a good discussion on where we're at as a society. You know, when you talk to pro-abortion advocates, a lot of times they'll talk about what a fetus is or what a baby is and when that starts. And so one of the interesting things is the science is actually fairly settled. And so when you start teaching truth in schools, it tends to move the window pretty far to one side when you actually speak truth. And so, you know, my son's sitting here in the crowd, not paying attention, but he's a seventh grader, and so, yeah, there he goes. It's one of those things where you start teaching those things, and their school does, but schools across the state of Indiana need to speak directly to life begins at conception, right? And we know that that baby is there at that moment and the miracle that occurs. And in medicine and science, we define it the same way. So there's really no controversy in teaching that. And so that was a good piece of legislation that, you know, we need to make into law. It doesn't stop. The schools are allowed to teach that now. We just want to make it the law of the land that they do teach it that way. On the other side of that is actually something I think that's even more important. And maybe it's just to slap the hands of physicians that kind of speak out of turn or speak mistruths, but we want to actually have the Department of Health lay out exactly what Indiana's law on abortion is, because they keep trying to say we can do this, we can't do that, you're harming women, and it can't be farther from the truth. We could actually push our laws way more stringent than what they are and not even come close to harming. And there's not one law in Indiana that prevents me from an emergency physician, as probably one of the most pro-life physicians in Indiana, from doing my job and doing it well. And so there's nothing of concern in the laws now. So worked with Susan B. Anthony on some of that language. We have that similar language in Senate Bill 240. We wrote a little bit different just because I wanted to push the Department of Health a little bit farther than they did in the House bill. But it's really important to actually lay out with the Attorney General and the Department of Health. And actually, the bill, the way it's written now, forces every physician to go through that training as part of their yearly required training that we have now. So it would be good to help spread some of that information and the truth in that, so people know exactly what the law is, so we don't move the other direction through a misinformation campaign from the other side.
Anyone else?
Yeah, the other thing too is, you know, we see in the federal or the national news all of these situations where the pro-abortion side is saying this woman couldn't receive care. And I think this helps emphasize, you know, all of these situations, if you actually look into them, it's all medical malpractice. And quite frankly, I think it's pro-abortion doctors that want their patient to die so that they can make a point. And I know that's probably harsh and controversial to say, but I think they want that instance to say, see, look what you guys did. I told you you were going to cause women to die. And I think they're just looking for that. And it's, again, I've used this a couple of times. It's disgusting to see that happen. But that helps kind of lay out the framework for these doctors to be able to not use that as an example.
And I'll go back to that, you know, I'm an ER doc in my day job. And our job is, it's impossible, right? To get it perfect every time. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about twisting the language of the law to not do what's appropriate for a patient. That's really tough as a doctor to swallow, because I've had really tough cases. People with pneumonia, things that surprise you, that's very different than what we're talking about in the care of these patients. You have an ectopic pregnancy, you have a premature rupture of membranes. Some of these cases can be really difficult to manage. They're not difficult ethically, though, from that case, because when you get into the downstream effects, the best thing for the baby is always to treat mom the most appropriately. So that's a very easy line to draw, is to have mom as healthy as she can possibly be, the baby has the best chance. There's actually no instances that I know of that anybody in my emergency department has ever had to contemplate abortion to save a woman's life. That's not something that happens in an emergency anyway, so we're not really talking about that in the first place. So when you have these places that say they want to turn people away or they can't take care of them, that just doesn't occur. It just doesn't occur.
Representative Lehman, in regards to managing the caucus on a pro-life front, how do you move things forward with people who may not be as pro-life as those we see here in Northeast Indiana?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So as a majority leader, you know, it's like herding cats. We have 70 people in our caucus. Now I'm going to go back to when we actually passed Senate Roll Act 1. I think if you look at the caucus, it was very easy for years to fill out your surveys because you kind of, I'm not speaking on my own here, I'm speaking from our members, who it might have been kind of easy to fill those out because you kind of had the feeling Roe v. Wade's never going to be overturned. Right? I'll never have to kind of pony up with what I've been filling out.
When you say surveys, what are you talking about?
Like right to life surveys. North End puts out a right to life survey. You fill it out. You know, here's what I have to do. And then when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I think it caused a lot of pucker in our caucus because now it's like, hey, now you have a chance to actually enact what you said. And so we had we got our list of members who had said, and we had, I'll be honest with you, in the Republican caucus, we had 2 or 3 that were said, they are not pro-life. They're just not. They are, fiscal conservatives. They will support several things on the conservative spectrum, but life is not one of them. So we knew going in, we had 2 or 3 members who were just going to be no's on everything we did. And then we had members, and I was in this camp of, again, coming out of the family with a lot of adoption, and a lot of those came out of a rape situation. I was one who had no exceptions. And I knew that I was in the minority in that. But so we had this list where everybody was at. Then you go back to them and you go, okay, if this bill comes from the Senate, it has these in, are you a yes or a no? And there were several people that said, well, I don't know. It's going to be hard to vote yes on this. It's got to be no on that. I think they really felt now they had to step up. And that was a very challenging time in managing getting the 51 votes we were going to need to get this across the finish line. And we knew we did not have the votes for the exceptions. But all I asked of the speaker was to give us that chance to vote. We had to have the ability to put on record that this is what I've said, this is what I believe, I don't believe in exceptions, I need the ability to vote for that amendment. It failed, but then I said, now I can absolutely support this bill, which has, I think, in fact, ended about 97% of abortions in Indiana. But managing that group has not gotten easier because now it's like, well, I did that, now you want me to do this, and now you want me to do that. And we do have a lot of, when you have 70 representatives from across the state of Indiana, north to south, east to west, you have a lot of different philosophies. You have areas that are saying, hey, I'm just not, I can't get that far when you want to go the next step, etc. But I think it kind of plays in with the issue now with the right to die and some of the momentum you might say that's out there among the public. One of the arguments I made on the House floor during the abortion debate was, God blesses us with life and we start down a line. And if the time we're conceived until the time we take our last breath, that's our lifeline. And nowhere do I think where the government has the right to say, I'm going to put a dot here. This is where your life should start, and right here is where your life should end. And so from that philosophy, I think getting the argument now is going to turn not so much to that dot on the line at the beginning is going to be where to put the dot at the end. And so this is, we talk pro-life, this goes to the whole thing. And we have members who are very, very strong advocates for life at its conception, maybe not as strong on the other end of the spectrum, because they go down the path of, well, what if somebody is, terminally ill, they have 3 months to live, shouldn't we do something to get them out of their pain, etc. So it's knowing kind of where we want to end, and then how do we get people to that end. And we do have, I'll be honest with you, we have the advantage in Indiana by having a 70-30 majority, because you're never going to get Democrat support on any of these issues. And yet you have some of your own colleagues who it's like, well, if you can't support it, you can't support it, but we're still going to move forward because we have the votes. I've talked to some of my colleagues who are either in the minority or they're in a state with a very, very thin majority. They don't have that privilege. They don't have the ability to say, hey, that guy we can cut him loose if his vote doesn't really matter, because they need all 51 of those votes. So it's a lot easier from my perspective, and I know that these guys are in leadership on their side as well. It's a lot easier to manage your caucus on these issues when you have that big of a pool. And so I think that it's just been interesting on the life issue alone to watch. There's some who have really absolutely stepped up and said, now is my time, right? And I kind of felt that I was given that privilege of now is our time. And then you have some who are like, I wish I wasn't here at this time, because I'll push the button, green button, I'll vote, but I kind of was hoping this would never come to this. And so I think that's where I think that's in the past now. So I think moving forward, it's not going to be as heavy a lift, but I think it's going to still be at times difficult to manage.
You mentioned the questionnaires in the VT Center round. You said something about the questionnaires, and this is maybe for everyone. By making that public statement about your positions on these issues, is that helpful when you're working within your caucus that way, knowing
Oh, absolutely helpful. I mean, well, the names I can tell you probably 3 or 4, I think probably 4 of our members who had been extremely pro-life on their surveys began to say, I don't know that I can vote this way. And you say, well, here was your survey from 2020, here was your survey from 19, here was your survey from 18, from 17, from 16. You guys were a tremendous resource in having that data, because it's easy to say I'll support something or I won't support something if there's no reality that's ever going to come about. And so I think those surveys became a wonderful tool, not just so that people, the public, saw what their representative or senator felt, but now they had to put some teeth behind what they actually said in their surveys. So the surveys, I think, were very helpful to get the information to begin with, but they became a very useful tool for us to get our caucus to the place where you've agreed to this in the past. You need to step up and vote.
Senator Brown.
And I was going to say, what is helpful is somebody has to take the lead, right? So, quite frankly, as a woman and a mother in the Senate, in my caucus, many times on these issues, even when I first was elected and Senator Holden might be carrying the bill, when it got to the floor in front of the entire Senate 50, I oftentimes went up there and spoke on the bill. And I don't need to be that person, but it does help. It helps your colleagues, because of course, when you have on the other side accusing, well, you all a bunch of men, you don't understand what you're talking about, you're making a woman do this, how dare you, etc. Well, it does matter. It does matter sometimes who the face of that argument is. And I will tell you, it's a little bit more difficult for Democrats to suggest to me as a mother that I don't know what I'm talking about, that I don't know the value of life, that I don't know what it means to be pregnant. It sounds silly, but it's true. And the flip side, in the past, through my health committees that I've been on and now as Judiciary Chair, we've had bills before the Dobbs decision that just said, if a woman went into an abortion clinic, could you at least make sure they're not being coerced? Because we had testimony from so many women who had been trafficked and had multiple abortions at the hand of their traffickers, forced abortions. Can you believe that Democrats couldn't even agree to vote for that? Merely asking as a woman walked in the door, are you okay? Because they just saw someone in the car who brought them being confrontational, and they come in looking scared, clearly don't have a partner with them or anything. Democrats can't even vote on that. So when we get criticism, and I'm okay with that, when we get criticism that we did not pass the best pro-life bill, we did. We passed the best pro-life bill we could, because the other side is never, ever going to acknowledge it's a baby. Ever. And so we have to fight for every inch. We have to fight for termination of pregnancy reports to prove that a 13-year-old was sexually abused and the abortion doctor refused to tell DCS that there was an abuser in that child's house, but was very willing to kill that 13-year-old's baby. That's what we're up against. And frankly, those are uncomfortable conversations for some members of staff, not because they're men, not because they're a father or they're not a father, it's just hard. And so it does help who the face of that conversation is, but then I'll tell you what, I have told my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, so you're okay with a woman being dragged in and trafficked just to preserve the sanctity of abortion. And sometimes they don't change their vote, but we need to continue to make the other side uncomfortable.
Representative Lehman.
Yeah, and I'll say this, you know your enemy. It's been interesting as the debate has continued. I think you used the term, rare and safe, and that was a Democrat mantra back in the 90s. We had a fetal pain bill in the House, and I was on the Public Policy Committee, and in committee, Planned Parenthood was testifying, and I pulled up data on prenatal surgery, and I said the first thing they do is they give an anesthetic. Why do you give an anesthetic to something that does not feel pain? Well, it's because of the motion, it's the pressure, they had all those excuses. So I just asked one question. I said, if science, which I think has already happened, if science proves that life, it is a viable life at this point where it feels pain, would you support our position? The answer was no. And I looked at Chairman Smalls at the time, and Chairman Smalls said, you could just feel the room go cold. You're in the presence of ghouls, is the term he used. And I said, when you stand there and say, we will stand for death because of our principles of a woman's right versus the science behind it. So that's my first thought. When you have these arguments over is it or is it not a life, and when you ask them directly, if it is proven to be life, would you support the life? And the answer was no. That tells you where we're at.
The other thing too, and I've told this story not to waylay this conversation, but there were years ago before the life bill, there was a bill to get rid of dismemberment, make illegal dismemberment abortions, and it was Representative Stutzman, I think, that Christie that actually was carrying that bill, and so it started in the House. One of the most prolific abortionists in Indiana came to testify against the bill, and my staff knows I'm telling the same story because I tell this story a lot because it's so horrific. She was 9 months pregnant at the time, so she had to move her chair back because her belly was bumping up against the table to testify. Testified against it. It passed the committee, passed the House, went to the Senate. She brings her baby, because she has the baby in the meantime, brings her baby back to testify against the bill in the Senate. It's evil. So she is arguing while she's got a baby inside of her and then a baby in her arms that a dismemberment abortion should be legal in the state of Indiana. You can't even reason with this group of people.
Every one of these issues, whether it's pro-life issues, there's other things that get heated and controversial too. Those discussions are always very interesting. I think when I was on the outside looking in, it's really easy to stand in the corner and yell and stomp your feet and why isn't this getting done? The process is a little bit frustrating on purpose. You're trying to convince 149 other legislators that your way is the right way to do it. That in itself creates difficulties. Not everybody thinks like us. Not every district sends the same person there. Not all of us have the same background. So it really does when you're sitting in a seat where you can influence things. Even on the outside, it's the relationships and those discussions really matter. And so, the life issue is one where we stand pretty firm on, but probably one of the things that I've moved away from is the all or none philosophy, because I'm going to get none every time. And so trying to move along that path as quick as we can to where we have 0 abortions in Indiana is the goal. And so trying to get every one of these steps. And so we'll keep fighting that and keep influencing. And I think one of the things you said is every time you go along this, you actually bring people along with you a little bit more because they get more comfortable. And I wish every colleague thought like Rep. Lehman and Senator Brown did in the Senate. and then the House, but that's just not the case. And so it's our job to influence them, it's your job to influence them. And if they're not voting the way we are, that's our fault for not getting them convinced, right? And everyone wants to talk about, we're gonna primary this person, primary that person, and it's difficult to move people from their district. They've been sent there for a reason, and they represent that, and they may be there for a different issue. And so trying to get the politics out of it is kind of naive to say that you can. So, and politicians tend to be a nervous bunch, and so you tend to overthink these things. And so there's a lot of other dynamics there.
I have a few more questions, but just as a reminder, if you do have a card that has a question in particular, we have staff members back at the far back table if you haven't already done so. All right, Zach, as I mentioned earlier, you're now both the CEO at Right to Life in Northeast Indiana and the Executive Vice President of Indiana Right to Life. How has your new role with Indiana Right to Life shifted your involvement in the political process?
Yeah, Right to Life in Northeast Indiana has always been one of the most influential, especially from a political standpoint and a legislative standpoint, of the affiliates in the state and probably in the Midwest. We're one of the largest affiliates, at least in the Midwest now, possibly the country. So we've always had a pretty good hand in that process, but now with my dual role, I am down at the State House at least 3 days a week, pestering my friends here to my right on a daily basis, seeing them all throughout the State House and just kind of putting bugs, not necessarily in their ear because they're right along with us, but in some of the other legislators that may not be as strong of a backbone on this issue, and just being there to support, having them see my face. But I'm here for the long haul to protect life at every stage that we possibly can. And so it's changed a little bit, and my time in Indianapolis has significantly increased. And working with legislators even more closely to find what can we do, what can we get past, what moves the ball forward, creating that culture of life. And I think that's a good thing for the whole state, and I think it's a good thing for Northeast Indiana to continue to have that influence.
Now, this is a question for you all. What bill died in the first half of the session that you wish had been passed? Senator Brown, or whomever wants to go first.
Well, I'll start because the House only passes good bills. Okay. So I can tell you all the Senate bills I wish had passed, but the House only passes good legislation. That's a tough question to answer because we do, by our rules, a bill has to pass one house to be eligible for conference committee towards the end. Because we tell people that's when the really work begins, you begin to put things together. So there were some issues, one of them being the zero cost adoptions and things like that you kind of hope had maybe gotten across. Now you're working on, okay, where can we find this to go? Because it's going to have to go. With the language to be there at the end on some of these nuanced things, then you need to get it into a Senate bill. So, we're looking at what's on our side that we wish to pass. You're not really giving it the death sentence yet. You're moving it over to the Senate and see if we can. There's things, I tell people there's so many issues out there that we deal with that I think are way off anybody's radar. Right now, one of the biggest issues I dealt with all the first half was a towing issue. Okay, well, I think if we had a forum today on towing, there would be like maybe one or two people here. Nobody cares about that. So but that's an issue now. We got to play Senate. So there's some things like that you're working on that you think I wish we'd have gotten it done on our side, but again, it's not a life or death issue.
So I think Senate Bill 241 was an interesting one that I'd authored that really hasn't gotten any movement yet, and it was that kind of RICO racketeering discussion on the abortion pill. And the thing that makes people uncomfortable is when we start talking about making abortions illegal. A lot of the things that we do are licensing and restrictions and those kind of things, but when it comes to this abortion pill, unless we have the law to use to go after those specific pieces, the Attorney General and the prosecutors don't really have the tools they need because it is such a unique thing. You know, the abortion pill is not a controlled substance. That's another way. I have another bill that does that. It's not as strong of a way to do it, but when you can start going after these folks under different statutes and opening up the law so that they can use it appropriately, because they are circumventing our laws the way that they're doing it now, I think that'd be an interesting piece to keep moving, and it is kind of disappointing we haven't gotten there.
I mean, I was hoping we would codify the TPRs and get some abortion pill legislation passed.
Thank you.
So, if I can, real quick, I will say one that we have not talked about that actually passed, which was 1006, which is dealing with rogue prosecutors, not just on our statewide abortion laws, but on other things, immigration, things like that. We were seeing some of, especially Marion County, the Marion County prosecutor publicly come out and saying, you can pass all the abortion laws you want, I'm not going to prosecute anybody. And we put in code, more codified in code, that you've got to prosecute the law. And I think that's something that I think is going to have some ramifications that I don't think people anticipated, and I'm glad that is on your side now.
I'm going to take the other side of that too, where we've got a few positive things moving in the DCS space. Senator Brown has some bills, so I'm going to champion some of those. But my wife and I are foster parents. We've adopted a couple times. And so it's been interesting having and dealing with the legalities and the frustrations and some of the good things in those spaces. So trying to champion those things so that kids have a place to go and it's easy to get them there appropriately is an important thing to me. And so I applaud Senator Brown for working on some of those issues, and hopefully we can get a good outcome as those bills move forward.
In your packet that you got, you have our handy little things to be aware of, but one of those things is House Bill 1006 that Representative Lehman just mentioned. That is one that Right to Life from Northeast Indiana. You can see we were actively tracking pretty intensely 72 different pieces of legislation at the start of session. But 1001 and 1006, 1001 being the budget and 1006 the road prosecutor bill, are two of the ones that we are actively working on and towards and trying to be as helpful as we can.
Then finally then, and in addition to the sheet that you're also going to find in your packet that has the list of all of our representatives, the state and government officials representing Northeast Indiana, the Senate, and then also in the House, and then our U.S. government officials and all their contact information. How do we best put that information into action, and what's the most effective way for us and our neighbors to be able to voice their opinions to you and support your efforts?
I think it's always better when it's personal. Whether you email or call our legislative assistant. In the Senate side, we have one assistant that we share with another senator. But it may take a couple days if they get a lot of emails or calls. But as opposed to a form letter, I mean, if it's a really controversial issue, they'll just do a head count, if you will. This many of sending a form letter for or against. But when it's specific to our district, when it's specific to an issue, and you give your personal testimony, but explain why it matters, that's more helpful to us. Because sometimes, to be honest, some of these surveys that we get, you really dig into them, and they might not even be people from the state, let alone my district. And I respond to people from out of my district. That's not the point. But that sort of allows us to address that. And then when we go into caucus, we can say, no, this is just not my opinion. This is just not a feeling I have. This is people in literally my district saying, this is how I feel. And I think that is more impactful.
It is this role is an interesting role. You hear from a lot of different voices, a lot of different people. And so what I'll say from that standpoint is, just like anything else in life, those relationships really matter. It's not really, maybe you've gotten to the point where you have to go scream and yell and protest, you've probably already lost the argument. And so making sure you develop those relationships early on and have those discussions so you can have that personal connection is much better than the screaming and shouting. I've been on the end of that on some controversial issues already, and I tell you that I have my interns in my LAs go stand in the crowd and just start talking to people, and it's interesting because a lot of people don't really have an argument or a discussion or a solution. They just want to be angry about something. That's not the discussion I'm really interested in having. I'm interested in having the discussion where you can inform me and educate me and get me to a point where I know more about why you think the way you are, why you're taking the side that you're taking, because that helps me form my opinion. Just yelling and or being angry at me for something isn't really that helpful in those sort of things.
And I think building a relationship doesn't mean you have to be best friends. I mean, I had a person come up to me in the store one time and they said, they asked me, "Are you representing Lehman?" I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Well, I've always wanted to ask you this." And I said, "Well, why didn't you ask me?" "Well, I didn't know how to approach you." I'm like, I'm just mad, right? I mean, you just come up and start talking to me. And I think building that relationship of, again, and I echo everything you just said. I've had people that their first interaction with me is just yell and scream and cuss me out. And I'm like, okay, we're off on the wrong foot, as far as building a relationship. So I think effective, even if we disagree, effectiveness is being respectful and being able to communicate respectfully to each other in a manner that, hey, how you doing, how's the family, and now let's talk about an issue we don't agree on.
Zach, do you have any, as not having held the office, but as a person who's worked within the process, what are your best recommendations, best practices, do you think?
I mean, I think most of our legislators are extremely accessible. I mean, you guys show up to these types of events, they do third house forums, they do all kinds of things where they're in the community, and then as Representative Lehman just indicated, sometimes they go grocery shopping. So we so often, and especially at the federal level, we look at our legislators as though they're the people we see on television, or they're putting out the postcards in the mail to us. It turns out they're actually human beings, and they're regular people, and they have thoughts, and they want to learn, and they want to hear from you. I've been told, I think it was Sue that told me earlier that I've got some work to do on this. I've been told that there's a group that thinks I'm this monster and this evil guy that whatever, that's fine. Like, come have a conversation. I think once you have a conversation with me, you realize, like, I actually genuinely care about people. I love God's creation, and I want the best for their lives. And I think once you have that conversation, it kind of neutralizes this image that someone has of me as the head of Right to Life. I think that's very similar to the situation with our legislators. You have this image, and maybe there's a group of people that don't like one of the three panelists up here. But as soon as you come to them and say, this is where I stand on this issue and this is why, it starts that conversation. And it's maybe at the end of the day you agree to disagree, and that's okay. But there's at least that conversation started, and I think that is incredibly valuable. I feel like we've lost that maybe as a nation overall, to have those conversations and be able to have tough conversations and sit down with one another and say, so why do you believe this? Why do I believe that? And that's unfortunate, but I think the main point is these folks are accessible in your community. They're also accessible at the State House. Come visit the State House. I mean, I'm there 3 days a week. It does not get old walking into that building. It's marvelous. It's beautiful. It's overwhelming. The history. It's a really cool place to be, and they'll all step out to talk to you.
I guess to follow up with it, sometimes you see groups come down and organize, and a group of citizens to come and visit you, to dovetail on that. How helpful is that for you in being able to be persuasive with your colleagues when you're trying to carry the message forward?
I think that's very useful. I all due respect to Zach, I see him all the time. Okay, he actually lives in the building I live in now. I can't shake this guy. Okay, what really appeals to me is when Zach comes with people from the district, when people he comes in, and they have people who aren't there. They're not carrying some lobbyist tag. They're not carrying it. They're just an individual who cares. And when you come in that number, that's more appealing, not just to me, but I think to my colleagues who say, hey, who is that who's that group of 20 people you had here today? Oh, they're down here for this issue or that issue. And so it's a conversation starter, if nothing else.
And I'll go to the next step also then. One of the things, you take pages and interns that can follow you around. How can we help our young folks to get involved in the process and be engaged with you as legislators? How do we get that done?
Yeah, I had a couple of pages even from our district this past couple weeks, and that's always an interesting thing for high school kids. And if you've got a grandkid or a son or daughter, just have them come visit with us, and they start understanding, get interested in the process. I think it's fascinating for myself, but the first time I got involved with this was Senator Bud Meeks, who was actually in my seat. I paged for him when I was in high school. And so it probably piqued my interest early on in that. And so, but understanding the process makes it less frustrating also, and getting to know the building a little bit. So, and I have people coming down Monday and Wednesday this week just to come sit and watch what we do. And they're, 40-year-old physicians that are just trying to understand the process and why we do things the way we're doing. So always happy to have people in the building.
Right. How is it when we get our kids involved in doing it? Where do they go? How do they sign up?
Well, I should know the Senate page website. So it's almost too late in the season to get the Senate page program. You could go there today. The Senate, if you go to iga.in.gov, there's a link to our Senate Republican page, and then you can get on the page website there to sign up. It's pretty easy. They take a certain number of time slots a day, so but that gets you on. The kids get to come on the Senate floor, sit and talk with us, watch the process. I have a young man, an 8th grader or a freshman that came in paged on a day a month or so ago, and he's been talking about it ever since. So I've gotten a couple messages and questions from his parents, and so it is a good process, good experience.
The house is the same. It's probably a higher bar to become a page in the house because of the preferred chamber. But I can't let that go. One quick story on this because it's very interesting. I had a young man come, and I bet he didn't say 3 words to me. Asked him his name. Here's my name. What grade are you in? 9th grade. Why is this kid even paging? And then his mom calls me the next day and said he would not shut up the whole way home. Because you showed him this, and you showed him that, and you talked about this, and you talked about that. And she said, I think you really caught the bug. And I thought, you blew me away. Because this kid was just totally disconnected. So you don't know what some of these kids do latch on to as they come. And again, it's the same thing. It's too late in this session anymore, I believe, but it's usually November when that opens up. November, December, they'll open up that PACE program. And you get, I've had kids say, I come, but I've got perfect attendance at school. You get an excused absence. It counts as a day at school. So you can set that aside, come down, and like I said, as Dr. Johnson said, you can come on the floor, you can be a part of the process in a way, and it's a really neat experience for kids.
One other quick follow-up too, if you know any international students, or you have any students that are just visiting from another country in an exchange program, get them down there. It is awesome. These guys they go above and beyond for these students. We had a young man, I don't know if you remember the gentleman I brought in from Poland, yeah, and he was extremely interested in how the U.S. government and state government and local government works, and so I took a day and I introduced him to the county folks and then some of the federal folks, and then he came down to the state house and got to get a tour and see legislation in action. You would have, he's going over there. I think he'll be, they have a presidency, right? A president. Yeah, I think he'll be president of Poland someday. This kid is sharp.
We still stay in contact with him on Facebook. Know what he's doing. And actually, the Speaker of the House, Brian Boston, at that time, let him come stand on the speaker's stand. And it was really neat. I got pictures of him standing there. It's a neat experience for the international as much as it is for the local kids.
We also do have interns for college-age kids. Actually, anybody could do it, but there's more than a handful of people in here that have been interns for us, and it is an interesting process. There's a lot of busy work in it, but you get to see the behind the scenes and the discussions and a lot of what goes on that's not public facing. So that's a good experience. If you have any interest in politics, or if you just want to get to know more about the process, that's probably the ideal way to do it.
And one more thing to add is Paige is great, interns are great, but everything we do down there is streamed live. So if you want to watch the session that day, if there's an issue you care about, it's live. The committees are live. My wife, God love her, she watches every day. Not sure why, other than to criticize my tie. You wore that tie with that shirt.
Or lack thereof.
Or lack thereof. No, it is neat because I do tell people, hey, this bill is on third reading on Thursday. Turn on your computer, click, you're gonna be able to watch the debate. You'll get to see who voted, how they voted. It's all right there. So I encourage you to watch what we do.
Well, thank you. Now we've got a few questions from the cards. We know that we're not defined by our abilities, our age, or our condition of dependence. But what is Indiana doing, and what could we do more to protect babies with life-limiting diagnosis, and then also at the other end of the spectrum, innocent life at the end of our lives? What sort of things can we do, and what things are we currently doing with our legislation?
Well, I think the first thing is education, is making sure that we always speak about any human life with dignity, that we make sure that we affirm the value of that life, regardless of how, to your words, life-limiting it is. But also, we also need to make sure they understand how supportive we are along the way in terms of the different kinds of programs. Like I said, the maternal health programs, how we support pregnancy resource centers afterwards, and then those who have lifelong disabilities. You know, how we try to work very hard to make sure that our budget supports their needs.
Yeah, right along Senator Brown's line, we really do need to have a lot of those discussions about
It's a
public service, about where we're spending our dollars. The public messaging, we're not as good at either to discussing that. But in medicine, we really need to talk about how we take care of people, and that's kind of, government does a poor job of a lot of these things. So as a private sector, we need to pick up the baton and kind of carry with some of those things too. So we talk a lot about healthcare funding and Medicare for all and those kind of things, but you really want to take care of people poorly, that's probably the direction to go, where we talk about really caring for people has very little to do with medicine at all. It's about dignity and spending time and caring. I mean, people have died in the world for millennia, so we're not talking about something new. It's how we treat those people as they're dying that really matters, and birth for that matter. We have more successful births than we've ever had in our history, right? Childbirthing has historically been a dangerous thing, that it's not now. And so we should be really proud of that, and yet we've kind of made it a very cold scientific thing rather than a miracle that it still is. So talking about those and championing those things. But as I said earlier, there's still a lot of things in medicine, and even as a state, we could define better to make sure that we're not crossing a moral and ethical line as we discuss about these things.
I also it's ironic that everybody's phones went beep. I don't know if anybody glanced at what it was. Searching for a missing and endangered 66-year-old female. That's caring about the public. That's caring about somebody. And I remember when we actually passed this bill, Sober Alert. We had the alert for kids, and now what about seniors? So I think as a society, it shows that we still care. I think that's the key thing, is not just the health related, but societal. Are people getting the help they need, mental health and things like that. And so I think our goal is always going to be not just how do we get someone from conception to natural death, but how do we make their life meaningful, and how do we respect them as they go through that process.
This is a question about funding, and the question starts with, what is the chance Planned Parenthood will be defunded, and do you think that will close their establishments? And then I would actually go with that. how does funding for organizations such as Planned Parenthood or like it, how can that be addressed at the legislative level?
The state doesn't fund them. So that's gonna be a federal issue. And so, in fact, by the way, we passed that Senate Bill 1 in the special session, we have essentially put them out of business in many places, even though, of course, as you'll recall, they were doing a lot of maternal health care and health care for women. Apparently, it doesn't really matter to them, or they really weren't doing it because their business was abortion. So, Planned Parenthood is, I mean, they're still here in Indiana, but they're clearly have not been as effective, thanks to us.
They're definitely clearly here because we are next door to them, coincidentally, of course. But some of our sidewalk advocates are here today, and that sidewalk advocates program is incredible. And so, if someone's thinking about what they can do to get involved, and I know we're not going to end up getting to that question to end this, but that is one thing that you can do as a pro-life community and get involved. And we have sidewalk advocates training, and we'll train you how to stand out in front of Planned Parenthoods on the sidewalk in a very loving and compassionate way. We want those women and family members to be able to go somewhere else that is life affirming and not pro-abortion, regardless of them not doing abortions in the state of Indiana. The other aspect too is we've seen a huge number of increased traffic to Planned Parenthood from the particularly the transgender community, and so they are going in for shots and pills and medicine and everything else. So we are next door, and we're going to stay there until they move out or shut their doors forever, hopefully.
Is there, and maybe this dovetails on those reporting process, but is there anything being done to try to track and measure the self-medicated or those mail-order abortions?
It's rather obscure for the most part on how you track that, because if you look at Massachusetts, they shield the abortion pill providers there. China, India, where they get mailed in from overseas, it's shielded. So federally, we're trying to get them to actually mandate the United States Postal Service, FedEx, UPS to identify those. So federally, if they can do it, I don't know, they have to make a controlled substance necessarily. You can define that individually so we can actually track those. I'm a states' rights person. I'd love to get back to the point where we can actually control our own destiny here in Indiana. I think that's a big piece of it. We shouldn't have to go to war with Massachusetts to figure that out. And sadly, Massachusetts is the one doing that. And so I think there's a federal component to that. We do have access to data, like I was saying earlier, that we can track and trend and guess a little bit at that. The number is way more disappointing than I'd like to say. It's probably in the thousands based on the information we have.
Anyone? I have an additional one, and this may be big box thinking, and to think of the most creative way that it can be asked. I know we talked about funding as it relates to adoptions, but if you had your druthers, if you could just make it so, what would you do to make Indiana the most adoption-friendly state in the union? What could we do to advance that cause? What can we do?
Well, I would say one is things like the zero cost, because you hear some people say, I know what my family went through. My sister spent thousands of dollars to adopt a child. We didn't spend anything to have a child, except birth. But I think we have to look at the cost, number one. Number two is if we really want to see the people adopt those who really need into a loving family the most, there's probably going to be coming out of that foster care system, the abandoned, the drug addicted babies and things like that. Then you got to give them long-term abilities. You got to give them long-term therapy, long-term health. So I think there's some pieces of this puzzle that go beyond just the act of adoption. I think it's the adoption and then a commitment to that family that we're gonna be here to help you down the road. And that comes at a cost, so you always have to then find, is that a public? I think that should be a lot of the private money needs to step up. But again, if we as a state can give you some credits for that, if you're willing to take those financial steps, then I think that's sort of the role we can play. I don't want the government doing it, because we will put all kinds of parameters around it and controls around it and then create a bureaucracy around it. If the public, if the private sector can fund it, I think we need to step up when it comes to tax credits.
I would say it's not even funding for some of the issues that I see. DCS is the Department of Children's Services, and they are the ones who decide, the child is not, it's not in the best interest of the child to stay with their biological parents, but they are so slow in actually getting to the point of terminating parental rights. And I just found out I have some bills that I've carried and also received some bills from the House, great bills, in this space. And it is disturbing how long it takes a governmental agency to actually pull the trigger, not just remove the child, but say that enough's enough. For example, I just found out that if there is not an adoptive parent family waiting, that the state has had children up to 5 years whose maybe even parents have voluntarily signed off, their biological parents, but because they haven't found a home to take them, they will not terminate their parental rights. So they're like in literally legal limbo. I mean, things like that are so disturbing, because obviously older children are going to be harder to adopt, so we have to figure this out. And our colleagues have been chipping away with this. We got a lot of pushback from the last administration, and they have a new director, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to move that along, because that's just so obvious. We already have decided that biological parent is not fit, so let's just move on.
If you're talking about abortion specifically, one of the most powerful things you can do is support a woman in crisis and in those early stages of pregnancy, and let them know that there's help. And actually, most of the time when you do that, the woman ends up keeping the child. It doesn't go up for adoption. It doesn't go into foster. So that early support is really important. And so we do have some funding for that. It could be more, but we actually need to look and see what programs are effective and where best to spend that money. So I think that's an important thing for us to do in the budget this year. But also, I mean, what she's already saying, I've been through all three different adoption processes now. DCS, private adoption, and agency adoption. Adoption itself is not expensive. It's a few $100s in legal paperwork to actually get the adoption piece done. So all the people that support a mom going through crisis can get expensive, right? Social workers, nurses, but volunteers are free. So one of the things I really praise my wife for doing is walking alongside women who are in crisis. That costs nothing. It takes phone calls, it takes car trips, it doesn't cost anything to do other than your time. And so that's really an important piece to make sure we're plugged in and in your community and know where those women are at. And just really making abortion unfathomable is really an important thing.
Zach?
Maybe the only thing I would add to that is and I really applaud Dr. Johnson taking in these foster kids. You don't really know a lot about this until you come face to face with some of these kids. And this really hit me last year. There was an 18-year-old who was down on her foster day. And she's very adjusted. She's in college. But she said, I didn't have my first Christmas morning till I was 11 years old. She said, I spent my first couple years in a closet. That's where I was put, so my parents could have Christmas. And then I got put into foster care. I got taken out of home and got put into foster care. And then in foster care, I got moved around. And one morning I woke up, it was going to be Christmas morning. I was so excited. And DCS came that morning and took me out of home. And she said, so it wasn't until I was 11 years old. And I thought to myself, I have 3 girls, and I remember how excited they were when they were 7, 8, 9, 5, to get up on Christmas morning. And I thought, here's a child who never experienced that. And we don't see that. The majority of us never see that. So I think you need to look at guys, those kids, and I think when you do that, you'll start to say volunteers are free.
I can tell you firsthand, I know of a little boy who was 4, and he and his 16, then 20-year-old mom had been out but she had met a really nice man who ended up asking the little boy if he could marry his mom, because he was the man of the house, so he did that. And then after that, that same man ended up asking that little boy if he could adopt him. But he was going to have to use the savings fund that that little boy's grandfather had given him for a sandbox. And so that little kid, being a negotiator that he was, and he grew up to, he said, "Do I still get my sandbox?" Right? And John Mildred ended up saying to that little boy, "Yeah, kid, you're getting your sandbox." So when we talk about it, it's big. It's very big. So thank you. So if you would, please thank all of our panelists for giving us their time today. We truly appreciate their We appreciate your efforts to support and promote our pro-life message. But before we dismiss, just a reminder that if you don't need your folder, please go ahead and set that off to the back, because we will reuse them year after year. And any donation envelopes, if you can place them on the bucket at the registration when you leave, you can take them for consideration. We're going to dismiss for informal discussion hereafter. And if you want to talk to your legislators one-on-one, we want to thank you for attending. But before we go, if we can just pray for just a second. Father, during our midst and our gathering here today, we just heard an alert. And we know that you listen to praying folk. And we know that these folks are praying folk. So please look after that person who's in distress, but also look on this earth and look after your children. Bless the people that are here to represent us, please, that fight for us, for our first responders out there trying to go help and help these folks. And please let us be more like you. Amen. Thank you. An informal time with them.